So the budget revisions tonight, we actually had an FFLA meeting this month, and we went over the highlights of both of the funds where I am recommending budget amendments. This is a little bit earlier than what we would normally do. We'll still have a full mid-year budget revision come winter, but given the significant changes for the general fund in particular, since the June adoption, we are doing this amendment now. And so without further ado, I'll start with the general fund. And if you could just go to the next slide. The general fund accounts for the core operations of the district. And some don't know exactly what that means. And so I always like to include a short slide, not only general education, but our special education students as well, at least those not in the center program that we run, and then also preschool through 12th grade and beyond, up to 26 years old for special education students here in Michigan. Next slide. The funding sources for the general fund, the majority of our funding source is the state-determined foundation allowance per pupil, and that is almost about 75% of our revenue. That foundation allowance per pupil amount then is multiplied by enrollment that is done in full-time equivalents. I just have to note and give a lot of thanks to our student services team, in particular Sandra, because the complexity this year with COVID and hybrid, in-person, distance, and going back and forth has been extremely challenging with all the different requirements and rules and how to count pupils this past fall. So by the time we got to about mid-November, we had a number to multiply in this equation, and that facilitated bringing you this amendment this evening. The state's budget process does start again in the winter, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But for this year, back in June, we thought we were going to have a huge cut, and we didn't, and I'll get into those details in a moment. And the last thing I'll say on this slide is the foundation allowance is actually comprised of both state and local sources. So our taxpayers, our residents in the district do pay an operating millage, and the part that is part of the foundation per pupil. Next slide. So looking at the general fund budget for this year, we are required, and the board adopted a budget before July 1st. At that point in time, the state wasn't anywhere near finalizing their budget, and the latest indications were almost a $700 per pupil reduction. So that first column for the original budget there actually had a loss of over $2 million, bringing our fund balance to 20.1%. And I'll show you that policy that Mark Bank referenced earlier this evening, but 20.1% is actually within and actually exceeding that even with the loss. But now fast forward to the December budget, and things are looking much better. In that column, you'll see the revenue exceeding expenditures by about $251,000. So I just call that close to a break even because we really fixated on the significant changes in the budget from the revenue and expense standpoint. That full mid-year revision will give us a better picture come wintertime when I bring that to you for all of the budgeted funds. But this update does put us at a fund balance percent of 22.1%. And the next slide, I actually do a crosswalk between the original budget and the December budget, which actually that last line should say December budget. It says original, it's not. So note that. So we do start with that $2 million loss at the top and then go through a bulleted list of some of the key changes. On the revenue side, the foundation allowance, where we were originally budgeting about a $700 per pupil loss last year, and then we had some recovery built in this year, and we were very pleased when the governor signed the budget on September 30th, once school already began, that we did not have a reduction to that foundation allowance this year. So that was a huge change. And then once all of the pupil accounting was done with a whole new layer of calculations and requirements, we are net down 45 full-time equivalent pupils. So the combination or the impact of that is in that $4.5 million positive number. And the positive change, again, we're swinging to no reduction in the per pupil funding. And even though we had a decrease in the student count, it's still positive. And it's also positive because of the COVID monies related funding. We have many funding sources, and at the Finance, Facilities, and Legal Affairs committee meeting with the board, we actually went over all of the pots of money that the district was that received and actually even applied for. Anything that was out there, we just kept seeking help to cover the additional costs that we saw as a result of the pandemic. So all told, it's a $4.5 million increase to revenue compared to what the original budget had. There was also some increase in Public Act 18 distributions from the county. There's a little footnote there that is the tax that the Oakland schools collects and then distributes and allocates to districts within the county. So that sometimes isn't always a positive. It was this year, so that's great. On the expenditure side, the adjustments we have are a net decrease. There were expenditure savings as well as these costs that are listed. I focused on listing the costs, especially those related to COVID. Let's see, there is a transfer out in here. You'll notice in the budget detail that I am recommending for board approval that increase, and that's because the general fund collected the distribution from Oakland County for their CARES funding, about $750,000, and we are moving that to the capital equipment fund where the devices have been procured related to our COVID needs and our needs of our students. So those are just some of the details. We did go over a different set of handouts at FFLA. On the next slide, so the next slide actually just takes these revenue sources and depicts them in a pie chart. And we have the local and state sources are the largest, and included in both of those slices it is a foundation allowance per pupil comprises the largest part of that. The next slide, I show you the enrollment trend, and I just maintain this year over year. It's actually about 10 years worth just to see where we're at. The reason there's two lines here is the total enrollments in blue at the top, and the general fund is less because we do run center programs. And for those center programs, those student counts and that money ends up in the center program. So I like to just show that difference. So we do have a total count that is usually in most of the data at the state level and in the databases. And then I also show exactly what the general fund funding is if you were to multiply that by the foundation per pupil. That largest dip that we see here, I have still noted in the purple bracket at the bottom that we did have the 2 years where our high school was on 2 campuses while the new BHS building was under construction. And so I don't know exactly, point by point or student by student if that was related, but I just thought that's always interesting to note that was during that time frame. On the next slide, another historical slide includes the revenue and expenditures by fiscal year. Red is expenditures and blue represents revenue. And here as we climb up, there's a note here that's small print, but the unfunded pension, the mandatory pension system for school employees, there's an amount that has just grown every year where the district collects the money and pays it right back out, and we're required to record it as revenue and expense. So as we look at that trend line, especially for my finance friends out there, it looks like, we're spending more and more and more, we're receiving more and more and more, but a large part of that is the gross up related to all of the pension changes and how that's being funded over the years. The next slide, I know from speaking with Cynthia Van Oyen that this is one of her favorites and has evolved over time with actually Howard Barron's help. because there's been a change in this slide in exactly which index we use. So this cumulative foundation allowance, this is basically going back, and Proposal A was referenced during some of the tributes this evening, and there's a lot going on in this particular slide. So if I could just point out to you that that very first column that says fiscal years 94, 95 would have been when Proposal A went into effect. And then every year since then, we're looking at the foundation changes, and the lowest funded districts are at the top. And we are in purple, it says Bloomfield Hills Schools. And basically, the Proposal A did narrow that funding gap of the per pupil funding for the lowest funding districts and then the highest funded districts. But what it also did is it really limited the purchasing power. And as we measure that in the very last section, there's this GDP price deflator. And so that percent change in the very bottom right with a blue arrow is 105% cumulatively since Proposal A went into effect, compared to with the purple arrow on the right, 18% is Bloomfield. So from an inflationary perspective, it narrowed the gap, but it also challenged higher funded districts like Bloomfield with not receiving as much of an increase over all of those years. The next slide actually takes the expenditures and puts that in a pie chart. And as we would expect, staff compensation is our largest cost in the general fund because that's what we're about, is all of our educators. And then there's a small amount in the rest. And when we talked about outsourcing and having to go through that difficult decision, when we have outsourced or contracted staff, which has increased and grown, especially with the privatization of some of the services. Food services are a separate fund, but some of our custodial, that would be included in the purchase services in the green. So I just thought I would point that out since it was mentioned this evening. The next slide is actually the policy that was referenced earlier by Mark Bank. And I do refer to Mr. Bank as the founding father of our fund balance policy. So this policy, it's been several years, I believe now, maybe 2015-ish, that this went into effect, but this has been our guide. Basically, we look at a range of 15 to 20%. 20% is the yellow or the warning light, and we need to start having conversations because once fund balance starts going downhill, as many Michigan districts experienced, it can go pretty quickly. So this has been our guide for a lot of years, and it has served us very well. 15% is the floor, but at the same time, should whatever circumstances happen in the future, this policy also allows the board to contemporaneously pass a separate motion permitting this to go below 15%. So this guide has really served us well, not only in committee meetings, but in study sessions and board discussions during times where we've had to look very seriously at budget balancing action. All right, so before I move on, I don't know, President Colon, whether you'd like to entertain any questions related to the general fund, and I have only a few slides left related to the International Academy because we did go through revisions for that fund as well.
Yeah, in terms of process, what I inadvertently didn't do is call for a motion, and then you should have done, a second, then you should have done the presentation, but you might as well just finish the presentation, and then I'll entertain a motion in a second, and then we could have additional discussion.
Okay. So the International Academy, this is actually a bit earlier, but again, because of some of the significant changes with the foundation allowance funding not having a change, that was very significant and impacted the Okma campus budget as well, because the tuition that sending districts pay, including Bloomfield for BHS students that attend, does tie into the foundation allowance. So back in the spring, we had an unprecedented number of meetings actually with the business officials that not only of Okma, but sometimes the other campuses join us as well, because of all the uncertainty. And so the tuition was actually built in with a reduction in the foundation allowance. Since that didn't happen, we actually went through the budget in the fall, and then in addition, we are required in accordance with the latest consortium agreement to provide the tuition for next year. It's very early to do that, but without a budget updated for this year and very preliminary for next year, we really couldn't come up with that tuition number. So we went through all of that so we could comply with the agreement. And then at the same time for this year's budget, I'm presenting the changes that we have. So on the next slide, if we look at the original budget actually started with a fund balance that's audited of about $72,000 and then had revenue over expenditures of about $87,000. The fund balance percent there is 2.8. Please note that the policy I showed you for the general fund is for the district's general fund. For this campus, the campus actually has 10 sending districts, and so it is the districts, the way the districts have always historically looked at it, are any monies held at the IA, which we had a discussion on what might be reasonable. It's something that we'll have to address going forward. I think it's a good idea to have some guide, and there are a lot of variables to consider, but our district policy does not apply to the numbers that you're seeing here at the bottom. The December budget looks better because the revenues are up because the tuition now has been restored. Without that foundational allowance reduction, that actually had us recalculate tuition, and that's been restored. And now we're looking at revenue over expenditures of about $268,000, which would bring fund balance to almost $341,000 at the bottom right column, and fund balance percent of 5.7%. So that is the December budget, and we will be looking at the International Academy again for the full mid-year revisions with the other funds. Next slide takes us through a brief crosswalk, most of which I already described with the tuition increase, but also good news as we did have 15 more students than were originally projected. So we originally projected the enrollment to be flat, and instead we had an increase of 15, which just helps. Any enrollment change, decrease especially, impacts the budget pretty quickly and significantly. So keeping that enrollment close to max or more is really positive. So that, I think, is it, except for the very last page. I would say for anyone that is still viewing from home or anyone else, there is a lot that we have on the website. And I know with any website, sometimes I find myself challenged looking for information elsewhere. And so we're always happy to help direct anyone, but there is right on the homepage a transparency icon, a tremendous amount of information. And so I'm just showing you some of the snippets of the information we have on our webpage and in the transparency section.
Thank you, Tina.
That's it.
Thank you very much.